Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by Geoff Zanelli. On today's episode, we will talk about his music for Fatale, his collaboration with David Koepp, and of course also cover the Showtime series called The First Lady. It is my pleasure to welcome back Geoff Zanelli.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you back on my show. Thank you very much, and I hope you're doing well.
I am. I am.
Recently, I was rewatching just a couple of movies which you also scored, and I know we did talk about You Should Have Left also extensively, but I would like to talk about the psychology of movie scoring, because to me, the psychological aspect is so important because the music adds so much depth and tension to a film. I mean, to me that goes without saying. And I'm always interested in exploring the psychological side of things, how music affects people, how music should take the audience inside the film, and just
Yeah.
it's just a whole different experience with music. So I was watching Fatale again
Oh,
just
good. Yeah.
just just last night. It's a thriller which was directed by Deon Taylor. What I've noticed is that, well, first of all, it's a very good movie. I liked it a lot, and it's a good thriller. And what I've noticed is that it has certain elements which I found very intriguing, and maybe you could elaborate on those aspects musically. But I
Sure.
really felt it added a lot of tension. It really helped getting me into the story, and the film also stars Hilary Swank, who's, well, a rather troubled, or let's say, quote unquote, psychotic person. Maybe you could, walk me through the process and working with Dion on that movie.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that was I think it might have been the fourth or fifth movie I did with Dion. He makes a lot of thrillers. We did Traffik and we did Intruder together. Um, so let's see, Fatale. So it was a little bit different because that had well, without giving away the story, Hilary Swank is indeed a troubled woman. She's sort of uh, well, she Michael Ealy plays a man who is married, but he cheats on his wife with Hilary. And Hillary uses that to kind of manipulate him, and so it's a little bit different from Dion's other movies, which in some ways are more um, well, he finds a different subject, I would say, to create the thrills for each of his movies, and this one was very much psychological, as you said, because she's using her well, she's using her knowledge of his actions to manipulate him into doing all sorts of things that you know get increasingly more dangerous and less legal, shall we say. um, but you're right, though, the music. Well, first off, I saw that movie without any music, and I'll tell you that you're absolutely right that music is the thing that in any thriller will finish it. It cannot be finished without one, and the only example I can think of is The Birds, which didn't really have a score, but is an incredible thriller. But even in that case, the sound design was the crucial element. So nowadays, we use a score sometimes to blur the line between sound design and music in a way that is less conventional. Fatale has a little bit of that, but it's also more of a classic noir style. There's actual melodies, and it's not just using the music as a sound effect. It's actually using it as an internal like a motion tracker in a way. It tracks Michael Ealy's character's uh, entire journey, really. Some of the sounds in there. I remember the first thing that Hillary does to manipulate him is she locks his cell. They have their little tryst in a hotel, and she locks his cell phone in the safe. So you cannot have it back until you do the following things. So that is like her first manipulation, and that's just the little seed of what's to come. And so I thought of writing some music that actually has a little bit of that kind of cell phone sound, I guess you'd say. There's a couple pieces that are, using the tone of it kind of sounds a little bit like a ringtone actually, and that's just like the minor tension. And as things get worse and worse, we're fracturing everything we can. I completely destroyed a piano to make the sound of a piano. Instead of it being like what we think of as kind of an innocent, beautiful instrument, it becomes a nagging, frustrating sound. Very high notes manipulated digitally to be, tense and all that. And we had a string section too, which I still think nothing beats that for bringing heart to any kind of music. And then what I also found really fascinating was getting into Hillary's character, because she has, there are actually some elements of her backstory that, tell the audience why she is what she is. She's messed up her marriage. She's no longer allowed to see her child anymore. She'll do anything to get to see her child. That's actually quite a healthy mothering type of experience, but she is not healthy. So there's that element, which is like the dark side of what otherwise is actually normal human behavior and what it can drive people to do. And so there's a lot, I think. She's also an alcoholic, so there's that to play with. And so this was quite a few dark places to go and write music for. And that, I think, is where I was using the strings for Val, is her name, to get that real depth of emotion, like what her actual experience is. So
yes, the movie at times reminded me a bit of Fatal Attraction. If I don't know, if you remember this one, Michael Douglas and Glenn Close.
I do.
Yeah, fantastic movie.
The bunny.
Yeah, I was just gonna bring it up. I'm sure you've heard the term, but there's the I'm sure Fatal Attraction also helped coin that phrase or that word, the bunny boiler.
Yes, right. Yes, I'm sure it is, and people know instantly what you mean when you say that. And I don't think there's any question that we're pretty firmly in that same territory. We have, it's psychoses driven by all sorts of different things. Sometimes it's driven by lust or love or attraction, and in this case, actually, a lot of Val's drive is she's actually trying to put her family back together. It's not going to work. It's interesting, I think, to go exploring these really dark things. It's also troubling to think about it in real life, but this movie, I think, is very much designed to, like Fatal Attraction, to be entertaining and thrilling and all of that, all at once.
Yes. Fatale, it was a one-night stand which turned into a huge disaster, and right. To say the least. And of course, his marriage wasn't going well in the first place, and then right. Things just happened, and of course then he finds out that his best friend is having an affair with
his wife. That's right. Yeah. No one's really behaving very appropriately in this movie, but he certainly isn't either. I don't think the one night stand is a good solution to his problem, but it's actually really an interesting movie in that there are very few people in it that, well, I can't think of anyone in it that's really innocent. It's sort of like this is how making one or two big mistakes turn into even bigger mistakes. And that, I think, it's in that sense, it's got something to say about morals and everything. It's interesting to get a takeaway like that from a thriller, which I think nowadays mostly there's a lot of shock value in our thrillers, but not always a moral tale.
It's supposed to be a quote unquote cautionary tale also.
There you are. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course now we're actually laughing about it, but it's if you experience it, it's no laughing matter at all. You know what I mean?
No, of course.
No, it's the
of course, and it's yes. My response to almost everything is to laugh, anyways, no matter how dire. That's just been my defense mechanism. So that's my own darkness, I suppose.
Oh no, I didn't mean to imply it was inappropriate.
Oh no, of course.
You know what I mean. It's
I do, of course.
Yeah. And of course the shock value. I mean, I feel, Geoff, that today's thrillers, or especially horror movies or horror slash thrillers, tend to focus a bit too much on the jump scares, and they really intend to shock people in a different way. I mean, I am more drawn to a scenario or a movie which lays out the story carefully, which really, let's say, puts emphasis on the horror and it makes you feel the horror, as opposed to just going for the cheap scare. And when I rewatched You Should Have Left a couple of days ago, I noticed that it was actually a well-crafted thriller. I mean, I know I know some people didn't like it too much because they expected something else. In terms of the jump scares, they didn't expect it to be a slow burn.
Yes, sure. It's interesting, and Fatale's a little bit like that too. And I'm with you on that. I'm drawn to those type of movies, and my favorite thrillers. There was a period in the '60s where this was the way thrillers were made, and I'm forever going back to the movie Images that Robert Altman made, or but even recently, I like Last Night in Soho. I thought that was beautiful. So there's a lot. Those are the ones that I think grab me a little more, and I think it's because they stay with you after you watch them. And whereas I've seen and enjoyed modern horror movies that are simply scary, but they don't stay with me. And Images stayed with me for decades at this point. So it's interesting to think about that, and what is it about that movie that got under my skin? Or I mean, The Shining is another classic example. Poltergeist is another pretty fabulous example. And these are all, by today's standards, they're viewed as more tame, I guess. But don't they stick with you a little bit in a way that, maybe jump scares are great for that moment. And those movies all probably have, or at least some of them have jump scares as well. But what sticks with you is the story. Yeah, so that's the thing, is if you're really pursuing a story,
absolutely.
Fatale and You Should Have Left both have that for you.
Sometimes you watch a movie and afterwards, or maybe it takes a day, maybe, or you should sleep on it, and the next day you realize, wow, that really affected me. That was a really, really suspenseful and really good movie, and the images kind of stick with you. And another prime example, and you just mentioned The Shining, which is one of my favorite films of all time, one of the best Kubrick films. Do you remember a film called Jacob's Ladder?
Yes, and there was a remake of it, but I remember the original one, which would have been probably in the early 90s.
1990.
Similar thing. Yeah. Actually, I remember some of the imagery from that, just as you've brought it up. I remember it's like the head shaking, and they did like a pretty fabulous looking analog, actually, effect, I think. Wasn't it just sort of some blurred? I don't think it was it was too early for CGI, right? Yeah. It was a practical effect, and that was really fascinating. That was a very cool movie. It's another one. It has a great story. And even if it's confusing, I remember what it's about.
It's quite it's a bit confusing. It takes
but it's supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the best scenes in that film, and I don't mean to dwell on that film, but when they put Tim Robbins on a stretcher and he envisions being taken to the hospital, and he's going through the psych ward, and those images are just really, really absolutely crazy and disturbing, and that will probably stick with me for the rest of my life. But but
then it's done its job.
it's done. But that's the whole point. Of course, I'm not talking about scaring people out of their mind, so they will have to go to therapy for the next.
Well,
but that's the essence of a good thriller and horror thriller to me.
Right. No, exactly. And I think for people who enjoy thrillers the way I do, and sounds like the way you do, it's actually like catharsis to watch a movie like this. Of course, no one wants any of these things to happen to anyone in real life, but there's still a reason to watch them, because you're kind of experiencing or I don't know, almost like cleansing some of those feelings in yourself. I think that's what these movies actually do. I think that's why we like them, because especially now, I'll tell you, these days with what we've all been through as a world in the last couple of years, it's harder for me to watch this type of challenging material, and I feel sort of rewarded when I do. But when I get to the end of the day and it's time for me to watch something and I've got a little bit of time, sometimes I just want to laugh. You know what I mean? And so it's not always like the first choice for me to go put on something that's thrilling or horror or something like that. But then when I do, it is kind of what I'm talking about. There's a certain I don't know, it feels a little bit like you've done a workout or something with your mind. You know, there's a potentially a cleansing that can happen.
Yeah, it can be emotionally challenging or draining. It can drain you a bit, but
right, sure.
The Secret Window, directed by David Koepp, who also directed You Should Have Left. We breezed over Secret Window last time we spoke. Correct me if I'm wrong. You do not have the major or solo credit on this film, but you ended up doing the heavy lifting on this score. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. So really, what happened? I think there was sort of a scheduling conflict with Philip Glass, who was initially slated to score Secret Window. I believe. I don't remember the film, but it was another film he was doing at the same time, so it just became a little bit, problematic. And I had never met David Koepp before, and I think what happened was there was the head of music at Sony at the time, who was making the film, the studio, was Leah Volek. She called Hans Zimmer, said, we're going to need to bring someone in on this movie, and Hans introduced me to her. She introduced me to David, and this was back in the day when the internet was not what it is now. So this was maybe 2004, I think, or 2005, somewhere around then. And so they would FedEx to me a videotape. If any of your listeners remember what those are, they're about the size of a brick, and it would show up in the morning, and I'd put it in the VCR, right? And I'd write some music. And the first day that I got it, I just had to stay up overnight and get it back to him as quickly as I could. And then David listened to it, and he was in New York, and I'm in Los Angeles. So he listened to it and he said, I sent him, I think it was 2 scenes. I really like these. Let's carry on. And then another tape would come. And then the next day, another tape would come. And the next day, another, next thing I knew, and I was barely able to even watch the whole movie, because the next thing I knew, I was writing, as quickly as I possibly could. We had, let me see, I believe it was 7 days for me to write, and then an orchestra session, and then 6 more days for me to write and a second orchestra session. And that was the entirety of the time that I had to work on the movie. So there were 13 days that I wrote music. Very fast schedule. But really what it amounted to was they needed the music. They were already dubbing, and they said, we don't have a finished score. So that's what I did. And in the end, without really knowing or planning or trying, I ended up writing about half of the score. And that would be the other half Philip had written already and was in the movie. And so which is why he's given the main credit. He did begin the film, but I actually didn't hear very much of his score until quite late in the process. It was a 2-week process. So it was like the second week when I started to hear what he had done. And that was because I had cues that had to go into and out of his music. So it was not necessarily, the type of co-write that I would have loved to do one day with Philip. But we had to work the way we had to work. And then, just an anecdote. At the same time, I also had a tooth go bad. I can't remember if I told you this last time. I had a tooth that I needed to go to the dentist for, which ended up being a root canal. But there was just no way I could spend 6 hours at the dentist to get a root canal with that schedule. I was already only sleeping 4 hours a day. It was it was very intense. So I was just eating Tylenol like it was candy until the day after that second orchestra session, and then I went to the dentist. But it was pretty difficult. And when I think about it in a funny way, it's sort of like method composing, is if you think of all of the misery that's going on for the poor people in that movie. it was only fitting that the composer should be miserable as well. That said, it was the first job I ever did for David Koepp, and we've, I spoke to him last week. Actually, we are friends. You know what I mean? Like that was the sort of a beginning of a fabulous collaboration. And then right after that, we did Ghost Town and Mortdecai and You Should Have Left. So I think that's it. We've done the 4 movies together. And again, it's another director that I'm sure one day I will work with again, But I don't know if you know, he's written another novel, which is coming out this week. And he wrote a novel about maybe a year and a half ago, which is being made into a movie as well. So I think he's obviously well known for being a screenwriter, but now he's also a novelist. He's also a director, and I think he's sort of, cannot stop him from wanting to create things. So.
Yeah, he's wearing many different hats, so to speak.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
It's inspiring. Actually.
Yeah, absolutely, and having excruciating pain while writing a score is probably that much fun.
I don't want to repeat that ever.
A root canal, oh god.
It was unpleasant, yeah.
Never had one, don't care to have one.
No, good luck to you. I hope you never have to. It is not that much fun.
Oh man. This wasn't the first time that you actually had to write very quickly and when deadlines were looming. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't Equilibrium a similar scenario?
No, that was more like, I think we had an okay schedule on that. I know what you mean though. That one, Klaus had started it, and then I think again it was similar to the story with Secret Window. He just didn't have the time. I don't remember it being I think we had a couple of months to write that score. I should say I did, but I did have to kind of pick it up and carry it across the finish line. And those are, it's a different type of job, I think, in that case, because the themes, a lot of them had been written, or I should say I listened to them and I was incorporating them into the score, and so that is it's easier and harder at the same time, because it's sort of like somebody else has begun a chess game and they get up and leave and they say, take over for me. You don't always know everything that they were planning and why they made those moves, so to speak. And it's not dissimilar from doing an additional music job like I would do for Hans over the years, or John Powell, or any of those people. Let me see, I actually am hazy on the timeline. I did work on the first Pirates, which was like that. There was about 3 weeks, I think, to finish the whole score of that movie from start to finish. But that was a much bigger team, right? There were maybe 10 of us. And Hans wrote all these themes, and and we all went to work. And I also did it for a movie called Hitman. I feel like Christopher Robin a couple of years ago was like that. It was a very quick 2 or 3 weeks. And then when we get to it, The First Lady was similar in that the schedule was shorter, although it's not quite as well. No, I think it was similar in that it was just that there's 5 times as much footage as a movie. So I had 12 weeks or something, which really amounts to a couple of weeks per episode. Yeah. Or a couple of weeks per movie length. You know what I mean? It's still, it was fast. So.
Okay. Yeah. The First Lady is comprised of 10 episodes, roughly 10 hours of footage, because basically most episodes clock in just 57 minutes of footage. And all episodes were directed by Susanne Bier, that's right?
Yes, that's right.
And it's not fairly common in the TV industry, or in that field of the industry, to have one director actually directing all episodes. So in terms of continuity and in terms of communication and actually getting the job done, it must have been helpful and refreshing to deal with one person alone.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's absolutely true. And actually she had a editor named Pernilla that I worked with very closely, and another editor named Sam that I also worked with closely. And they, I guess it I don't know if they weren't necessarily alternating episodes, but they seemed to kind of each have a department, so to speak. And in fact, actually, most of the day-to-day work was directly with them. What I find with Susanna is she, and actually this is very, very helpful that she directed all 10 episodes because of this. She looks at the big picture more so than probably any other director I've ever met. So much so that it was not that helpful or useful for me to send her one scene or two scenes at a time, because what she's really after, what she's really looking for, is the, like, I would call it the cumulative effect of the show. So for her to review my music, I quickly found out and figured out that the best way is really to score the whole episode and show her the whole episode. And I think it's kind of a beautiful way of working and not common. Most of directors I know, we sort of work in piecemeal, or we might say, okay, let's really get into a love story, and for the next 2 weeks, we're looking at just those cues or something. Susanna likes to watch, even when the editors would tell me, they don't just show her a scene. They go, here's this is 20 minutes of the show. What do you think? And she's very capable and able to track everything across all that time without getting lost in just looking at the details. And I think she understands more than a lot of other directors the difference between putting a small stone at the head of a river as opposed to when you'd need a giant stone further down the river to move the water, right? So what she does is she looks at it, she goes, okay, I think if this were slightly more, I don't know, more sad, or I'm just saying, the type of comments I get from her were very macro, I guess. It was never move that little flute note 2 seconds later. It was always, okay, I'm not feeling the emotion that I want to feel right here. And it might be because of the music right there, but it also might be because of the music 20 minutes ago. We didn't set it up right, and those are much more, I think, the types of comments that she would give. And I think is more helpful in a way, because she really is leaving it up to me to think about the notes and the details and all of the architecture, and she's only weighing in when she needs to. There's a great deal of trust, I think, that she places on her, everyone, her editors, her composers, her actors, and I think part of that is why she's able to attract talent like this.
I love shows about politics anyway. I mean, it's to me, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of either everyday life or about the movie making industry, because politics basically dictate everything.
Right. Sure.
Everything is about politics in some shape or fashion. How would you, Geoff, describe the fabric of this show? How did you connect these three main characters and areas?
Right. Well, that's what I found so fascinating about it, actually. So they sent me a couple episodes just to give me a feel for the show, see if I was interested, and of course I was. I mean, I was interested as soon as they said we have Viola Davis and we have Michelle Pfeiffer and we have Gillian Anderson. That's already exciting. And when I watched the shows, the first thing that I thought, before I watched them, the concern was, I don't want this to feel like a history lesson. I hope it doesn't, right? And then I hit play, and it didn't. And it felt like characters, stories, events, and that's what I'm attracted to more than anything. I'm not really big on history. I mean, I say that sounding a little naive because I score a lot of historical television shows, but I don't approach it from the lens of history. I approach it from the lens of character and story. So that's what I found really fascinating. Then the question I asked myself was, what is the reason why these three ladies are all in one show together, right? Because you could make the show, it could be 3 episodes dedicated to each lady, right? It could be a whole season of just Eleanor Roosevelt, but that's not what they did. They chose these 3 ladies, and why? That was the first thing I wondered. And then as I watch it, you start to realize, there's a great deal of shared experiences, even though these ladies are 80 years apart from each other, right? Or more, actually, I guess. There's something very, I guess, comforting in thinking about how those experiences are shared even across decades, and how certain things just are universal. They haven't changed, and some things have. So then it becomes apparent the show actually has kind of a yin and yang, right?
Yeah.
Half of the show is about the shared experience of being a first lady, which, at this point, not that many people have had that happen to them. You know what I mean? There's only been so many presidents. There've only been so many first ladies. So it's a very unique experience. There's only ever one at a time. You know what I mean? And so that part of the story is how do they relate to each other? And then the other half of the show is what's individual and unique about each of these ladies. Then what makes them so iconic, right?
Yeah.
And so that I thought was very interesting. And when I pitched my thoughts for the score to Susanna, that was really what I said. I said, there's a place which we can always return to, which is their shared experience. And we need to go off on these individual stories as well. And that's it. That's the balancing act. I don't think it's really that complicated. It just takes a bit of planning and work. The other thing I said to her was, I do not want to write a period score for Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't want to do it that way, because I think we'll start like almost taking sides, because necessarily Michelle Obama is going to have the cooler music because it's closer to present day. And, and then, so it was more about like, that's not what the score is for. We can do that with the songs. And Sue Jacobs, who is the music supervisor, I thought did an incredible job of finding, songs that felt time, they define the time period, they feel appropriate, and they also have usually a nice, thoughtful connection to the story. So including the main title, which I'm just going to plug it here and say that Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings version of This Land Is Your Land is just, it's beautiful for this show. Anyway, that I thought was, that was how we were going to take care of the time period thing. And the music instead would actually do the opposite. We're going to kind of glue it together, use it as a thing that links the ladies. And, and then I guess from there you can kind of see, if you watch the show, there are certain pieces of music that sometimes kind of play more often for Betty than for Eleanor, or play more often for Michelle than Betty. But generally speaking, there was never any hard rule about this is Michelle Obama's theme, this is Eleanor Roosevelt's theme. I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be the First Lady's music, right? And there will be certain individual things in each episode, like if you were watching episode 8 last night, the commencement speech that Michelle Obama gives, that was unique to that episode, and it's tied to one of our themes, but it's a Michelle moment, clearly, and it's played as such. And Betty obviously has her own struggles with addiction and with her health, and I think her sort of unique story lends itself to some specific music as well. And she has a redemption story too. She has, darkness she has to come back from. So
it took me a few minutes to really get into the story, because they kept, going back and forth, and you have different time frames. Yeah. Yes, it's of course about the first ladies. These three ladies are supposed to be the focal point of the story, but the bottom line is that every character basically is very important. The presidents of that time, their husbands, the press secretaries, Rumsfeld, and everybody who's giving them a more or less hard time in terms of politics and election and votes. But what I found really interesting, and you just put it very well, the music is not based on history, but it's based on characters and emotion.
Yes. Right. Characters and story. And also what I think is, important to this score is that, look, it's so easy when you're talking about American history and these big events, and Nixon and Watergate and all, these are like huge pillars of American history, and they're grand moments. But the stuff that I think is most important and most interesting in the show actually is the intimate moments. And what is, look, there's a scene in, I think it's in 5, Betty has a mastectomy. She has breast cancer. She has to get a surgery. She looks at herself in the mirror for the first time. She takes her robe off, and she's quite reluctant, I would say, to find out what she looks like after the surgery. It's obviously an emotional moment for her, would be for anyone. And that scene is scored with a solo piano. So that's literally me, like at the absolute limits of my ability to be, an emotional piano performer, doing what I can for the scene. And there's no grandness at all about it. It's so fragile and so beautiful and so powerful. And I remember that was one of the scenes I saw. Okay, before I wrote a note, I got to watch all 10 episodes, right? So I had the whole thing in my head at least once through, and that scene stuck out to me. I thought it's going to be very important to a certain part of our audience, anyone who's been through this, and it needs to be treated with a very appropriate high level of reverence, because it's powerful, moment in Betty's life. And I think the audience, well, I know the audience responds to it because I hear them talking about it. It's that scene in particular got a beautiful social media response, and people just going, no one's showing us this. No one shows you what this is actually like on television. And even though, of course, it's a television show, it's getting much, much closer to the truth and the honest, reality of what that's like for anyone who's had a mastectomy before. So that to me is like, that's important. That's a pillar of the score. It can work. One person hunched over a piano. The string section for this movie was 5 players. Occasionally we layered them a little bit, like for instance, when the Obamas go to the White House, that's about as grand of a moment as the show ever gives us. And that is grand, but it's not played to feel like a blockbuster. It's played just to match the scale of the show. And I think most of what really, really is going to resonate for people is the intimacy and the story and the character. And very different from my other, I guess the other 2 big historical shows that I'm known for were Into the West and The Pacific. Those were much, much more grand in terms of how the music was approached for them. This is like, I don't want to understate how difficult it is to write this kind of music. It's very, it's profoundly difficult, and especially because you really have to commit to the emotion and to the performances that all of these ladies brought.
Yeah, and also to explore on the background of these characters. I mean, there's a lot of intimacy, lots of problems, either in terms of politics, their day job, or personal issues. I mean, Michelle Pfeiffer's character, Betty Ford, she's, as I mentioned, she's an addict. She's, has substance abuse issues. She's an alcoholic. Then Gerald Ford has problems of his own. Then you have the Barack Obama, Michelle Obama storyline. They have to deal with the Trump issue and so on and so forth.
And racism is a big part of there.
And racism and the gay marriage and so many things. So many things went on. And then you have the Roosevelts, Theodore and Eleanor. So you had to cover quite a lot of ground there.
Yeah, no, it's true. And actually with Eleanor, because she had a mistress, she had a girlfriend, and that's obviously that ties really tightly into the Obama story, which obviously when Barack was in office is when marriage equality was a big topic, and things changed here in America for the better, in my opinion. And I think Eleanor's version of that story is she lived out her life at a time when that wasn't possible. And I think that's interesting. And it was actually sort of hidden. Well, no, it was completely hidden. And nowadays we know because we've discovered the actual letters that she wrote to Hick, and we know this happened. So I find that incredibly fascinating. I think it's, powerful to think that Eleanor Roosevelt at that time in history, when she was uncomfortable even getting a divorce from her husband, so she didn't, still was able to find a way to live this life, under a system that was much more oppressive than, I'm not saying it's perfect now by any means,
No,
but she couldn't have married her girlfriend. if she wanted to.
No.
So, and I'm sure she probably did want to. So it's very interesting to see the parallels between that, and also to see what I think is inspiring, to see what Eleanor was able to accomplish despite the fact that, you know, her social environment didn't allow her to even be herself really publicly. So, you know, she's thought of as an intellectual, and I love that this show kind of turns that on its head, because of course we know she was brilliant and an intellectual, and she probably was just as capable of running the country, which would not have happened at that time in history either. But at the same time, she also had this whole emotional life, you know, that I think gets lost sometimes, because we talk so much about, you know, her politics, but this is her life. It's really fascinating, I think, to be able to tell all those stories, and, you know, it not lost on me how important they are. And, you know, I've used this word before, and I hope it comes it sounds a little weird, but it's kind of, it's a burden to kind of take those stories on and tell them with music, with anything. So anyone who, you know, starting with Susanna Bier, who said, yeah, I'll make it, or Aaron, who wrote the show and produced it, you know, they all had to go, okay, we're going to take this on. We're going to take on this, maybe burden isn't the right word, responsibility, you know, to do right by these stories. They're actual people, you know, and especially in the case of Michelle Obama, she's still around. She's still on TV. You know, it's really hard to tell those stories, I think, because, you know, we're having to tell it through the lens of this show. And I don't know, it's quite an honor to be part of it.
So much history, and I think these people have accomplished quite a lot. And even though certain things were not that well received at first. I mean, I think Obamacare, for instance, was a big issue, and I think his approach and his willingness to, let's say, be a proponent of that was just admirable. I mean, you should have proper health care, and
of course. I mean, it's so interesting. It's like some of it. I don't know. Some of it just seems like a no-brainer to me, and I know it's politics being what it is. Everything becomes difficult when it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, some of these things seem obvious, but I really like that Michelle Obama's story in the show about her father not receiving proper health care. You know, she lived these things. She's not just taking on the cause. She actually lived through them. She's, you know, it's not to say that if someone like me, I've had access to good healthcare my whole life. It doesn't mean that I can't be an ally to people who don't have that access. But I think Michelle has a particular personal vested interest in it. And, you know, and actually speaking to healthcare, even Betty's story has that, because she came out very publicly, said, no, I have cancer. I got a mastectomy. I found out I'm going to do this surgery. She very famously waved to people through the window of the hospital, and the scene where she throws the football after surgery. That's all true. You know, she did those things. And it was at a time when I think she was encouraged not to talk about these things publicly, but she did anyway. To me, that's what I liked. Betty's whole story is there's a lot of things about her that she shouldn't have done, you know, she should have tried to control or tried to get help for her addiction. You know, it sort of appears to have started when she was in her 20s. You know, it's something that was a long road for her before she got to her redemption. And I think just the fact that she was able to open the Betty Ford Clinic, put her name on it, say, this is why I'm opening the, you know, those are very courageous moves. And I think a lot of what attracted me to her story in particular is that I think she's absolutely willing to be vulnerable in front of other people. She's willing to tell you how she feels. She's willing to use her platform to try to help people. I don't think that's radically different from Debbie Harry or Haley Williams or something. Do you know what I mean? I think those are powerful women who also go, this is me. I make mistakes sometimes, but here's what I think. You know, there's something really beautiful and courageous about it. And I just thought it's so easy to get inspired by these women. They're role models.
Everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes you have to go through some hard times to eventually have a better life. Sometimes you have to not do well in order to
Yeah,
achieve greatness or to become successful. It always depends on the circumstances, but I think you get my point.
I
And
do.
in terms of your line of work, you of course want to be busy, but it's always also about long hours, communicating with so many different people, and you have to have a great intuition as a composer in order to react properly to the story which they present you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's all true. And actually, it brings it back to what you were saying at the very beginning of our talk today about it being psychological. There is a psychology to all of it. To just, I mean, if you're just talking about the day-to-day life of a composer, it does involve managing people. It involves, talking with your filmmakers. And obviously, I have a staff. I have people I work with. And yeah, I think you're right, and I think even relates a little bit to politics too, because there are certain ways you will benefit from speaking with other people, and certain ways that aren't so good. And I see examples in my career of composers who behave in ways that I want to emulate, and behave in ways that I don't want to emulate, and those are I probably present both of those things to the people who see me in the industry as well. And we're always trying to be better, but that's really is what I think what the First Lady is about, and especially in Betty's story, where it very much is like warts and all. There's a lot of mistakes. Some of it is choices she make. Some of their hardship in her life is not actually choices. I don't think she chose to get breast cancer. It wasn't really a behavioral issue. It just happens to some people. And what are you going to do with it when it is given to you? You know what I mean? And I think she found a way to parlay that into helping women take more of a hand in their own healthcare. I think you see the same with all of them. Actually, Eleanor's radio addresses, I think, were very inspiring, not just to women, but probably particularly at the time. And it's hard not to think of Michelle Obama's strides in healthcare as not being, of course that's inspiring. It all is. So these are the, so easy for us to find role models in our rock stars and our movie stars, but when you really get down to it, it is about actual people doing actual things. And sometimes, I don't even think that Betty Ford was necessarily good at politics. I think she was just good at being herself, and that was enough. And I think that's actually inspiring. I think really, actually, other than Eleanor, I don't think Michelle or Betty necessarily wanted to be first ladies or enter politics in that kind of public arena the way that you just sort of have to if that happens to your family. If your husband becomes elected or something, there's a reluctance, I think, to their two stories, whereas Eleanor, I think, quite enjoyed being in the East Wing of the White House. She probably would prefer to be in the West Wing of the White House. In fact, I think there's a quote that someone asked her something, are you going to move into the White House? And she said, why would I do that if I'm not president? And I think that's just really shines a light on what she knew, what her capabilities were. She knew that she certainly could have run the country, and I think in a different time period, if she were alive now, who knows? She could be running for president.
Absolutely. So much pressure goes along with it, and of course, being able to interact with people, networking, which is also especially important in these days, because also social media allows us to have a different access to that, which is also, important for you and also for me. Geoff, is there anything else you would like to mention and talk about in terms of the First Lady? Anything else that comes to mind before we wrap up today?
I think I would just say, like I was saying before, I just considered it an honor that I got to be part of it, and it was a fast-moving train, I guess, that I jumped on, and I hope people are enjoying the show.
Geoff, thank you so very much for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that, and it was great to catch up again and to chat, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I very much did. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Great.